Hello there, Booktube. It's Roz, and it's been a while, hasn't it, since I was here on Booktube. In fact, I think it's just over 3 months. The last video I made was the 8th of November. I went back and looked. So here I am to give a little kind of personal catch up about, what happened, where have I been? And I'll do some, then really most of this video will be kind of like highlights of my reading of the last 3 months, to kind of bring me back up to date so I can get stuck in again and in this our ongoing conversation about books. So why did I have this Booktube pause? What happened? Last October, I was a host for Victober, which was absolutely wonderful. Such a joy and a delight. I really enjoyed it. But it was quite full on for a fairly casual, laid back kind of booktuber like me. I'm not someone who does this very professionally. And early November, I made a couple of videos, and then I thought, I think I need a little rest, a little break, to recover my energy for this. And it was just meant to be a holiday of a few weeks. But then it became December. Life and work and things kind of threw up a few unexpected challenges. Nothing too dreadful, but just things that got in the way. Not least of which was a really hideous winter lurgy that meant I was coughing constantly for about a month, and making videos would have been really difficult. Not difficult for me, but not very nice for you, because I just have been coughing at you all the time. And then over Christmas and New Year, I had, for reasons that are too long to explain really, but I had to dog sit for Tilly, my daughter, of Tilly's Shelf, her channel. And that meant going and staying in her house in Leeds. And so routine was a bit messed up. And then I was kind of expecting, though, to restart making videos by then, once the cough stopped. And then Tilly's dog and me and a dark and rainy night and an unexpected encounter with a fox resulted in a very unfortunate break of 3 bones in my hand and a month in a cast. And, well, if you've ever had a hand and an arm in plaster, you will know that it just makes life incredibly laborious, I think is the word. Everything's just really hard to do. And I was just really tired and had to work and had to get on with the rest of life, and something had to give, and it was the thought of making videos. So, but I'm now, it's the middle of February and I'm back to normal, and I thought I really should restart. But the really weird thing, and you've probably experienced this with things in your life, that if there's something that you're used to doing and you're in practice of and you kind of do quite regularly, and then you stop doing it, it's weirdly difficult getting your head around restarting. I had a couple of things to help me, other kind booktubers that got me to do things in the gap. I did a discussing drama video with Tilly at the end of November. I did, Sean, the book maniac, invited me to do a bite-sized book chat, which was delightful. And then I had a lovely live chat with Greg of Another Bibliophile Reads and Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics. So that kind of helped me not forget what videos are all about. Plus, of course, I've been watching and commenting and reading. Goodness me, never stop reading. So I just had to think, how could I ease myself back in? And there's a bit of me that is finding it quite weird to have not done a my best of 2022 video. And for a while I thought I ought to start with that, but that was just too big to start with. I'd be interested in your opinion as to whether it's too late to do that now, or whether maybe I should at some point go back and do my best of 2022. I don't know. Tell me what you think. While I've not been making videos. I've read a couple of really interesting books from kind of far-flung parts of the world, far-flung for me, obviously not if you live there. One from Burkina Faso, one from Niger, and I really want to do scallywandling videos about those, and I will, but that didn't feel like the best way to start. So what I've decided to do is I'm just going to do a kind of a catch-up of my absolute reading highlights, you know, the top spots of November, December and January, and then at the end of February I can kind of be back into my usual routine of doing a monthly Delights and Discoveries wrap up, and yeah, getting everything back underway. So I read 40 books in November, December and January, so it needs to be the highlights or we'd be here for hours, and I think that 9 of those were 5-star reads. I won't go into how ridiculous it is rating books and, you know, how sort of arbitrary it can be, but you know, I do it on Goodreads to remind me of things, and there were 9. So let me tell you about those. Now, if we think right back to November, Bob the Bookerer was encouraging us with his appalling plan, pun, not plan, it was also a plan, but based on a pun, of Ernaux-vember, to read books by Annie Ernaux, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year. And I did, and I read Happening, which was such a fine book. Ernaux has a very distinctive way of writing that's quite unusual. And her translator, what's her translator called? Tanya Leslie, I think really captures that really successfully. You know, I feel like, although I'm reading it in translation, I'm getting what is so unusual and special about Ernaux's writing style, because her books are always, or certainly the ones I've read, kind of on the borderline between memoir and history and fiction. And Happening is about a time when she was in her very early 20s, back in the early 60s, 1963 I think it might have been, and when she was a student and fell pregnant unexpectedly, and then is seeking out an abortion, which was absolutely illegal at that point in France. And in the book, she brilliantly binds together sort of young Annie, who's going through this experience, and Annie 40 years later, you know, Annie in her 60s, remembering and reflecting on her younger self and that experience, and revisiting some of the places where she went at the time. And it's very short and it's superb. Another author with a very, very distinctive writing style is W.G. Sebald, German author, died relatively recently. Well, can't remember the year, but he's one of the few writers where I really want to read everything that he's written. And one of the ones that I've been meaning to read was The Emigrants. And in contrast to the Ernaux, this is definitely fiction, but rather than being sort of non-fiction that reads like fiction, this is fiction that reads like non-fiction. That does make sense, doesn't it? It reads as if it is for kind of like potted biographies or life stories of real Jewish immigrants who are in some way connected with the narrator, and the narrator feels as if it is Sebald himself. He uses real photos and builds those into the story as if he's writing about those real people, but actually they're just photos that he's found that he kind of incorporates into it. It's read a book by him if you never have, because it's really hard to convey what is so extraordinarily unusual and satisfying and rich about his writing. You can tell I loved it. It was a buddy read that I read with Sina of Beating Around the Books, and I think she read it in the original German, and I read it in the translation by Michael Hulse, and we both very much enjoyed it. Another great buddy read I did in those 3 months was Train Dreams by Denis Johnson, which I buddy read with Brian at Bookish. But the reason that I particularly wanted to read that book was down to another booktuber, Greg, supposedly fun, because Greg's been doing this. He's got this sort of long-running series he's doing about Pulitzer Prize, the Pulitzer Prize and Pulitzer Prize winners. And I watched a video sometime last year that he put out about the 2012 Pulitzer and how mysteriously they didn't award. They had a long list of finalists, a list of finalists, and didn't award a prize. And Train Dreams was the book that he thought probably should have been given the prize and wasn't sure why not. So with that recommendation, I fancied reading it, and when it popped up in one of Brian's videos for some reason, we agreed to read it together. It's a really short book. It's a novella, not a novel, really. And what it does quite magically, in a way, is it gives you a whole life in a very short space, a series of incidents that kind of express the whole life of a very ordinary man, American orphan, sort of born in the 1880s, and it takes you up to his death in the 1960s. And he's a railroad. He's in the West, a railroader, builds railroads and things, bridges, and and a logger, and that sort of vaguely sort of pioneer-y experience, and just in that short space it packs in so much, but in a style that appears very simple and yet is very, resonant somehow. Yeah, it really worked for me. Another book that's quite short, a bit more than a novella, 200 pages say, but covers a whole life, and in a way that is both, quite simple in style but very rich in content, is The Waiting Years by Fumiko Enchi, and she brought that out in 1957, and I read a translation by John Bester. And this was, I have to say, it's not just one of my best books of the past 3 months, but definitely will be, if I made that best books of 2021, 2022 video, The Waiting Years would absolutely be there in my top few. But I'm not going to tell you anything more about it, meanly, because this is the book that I talked about with Sean on his Bite-Sized Book Chat. So I'm going to put a link to his Bite-Sized Book Chat. And if you're at all interested in writing by one of Japan's sort of absolutely best-known 20th century women writers, go and watch that Bite-Sized Book Chat edition and read The Waiting Years. Now, in December, I have a bit of a tradition, personal tradition, to read genre books, the things that I tend perhaps to neglect in favour of literary fiction. What does that mean? But you know what I mean, shorthand. Non-fiction and poetry and play. There's things that I read all the time, and there's things that I read less often, like humour and horror and fantasy and science fiction and romance, those things. So in December I try and crime. I probably read a bit more crime, but so those are things that I try and visit, particularly in December. And I did that again this year. And of those, the best one for me that I read, my top sort of genre choice, as it were, was Vita Nostra. And that's a 2007 fantasy novel by a Ukrainian pair of co-authors. I think they're brother and sister or husband and wife, I can't remember. Marina and Serhiy Dyachenko. And it's translated by Julia Meitov Hersey. And it's fantasy, but it's almost horror, and it's a bit YA, and all those things are not my normal enthusiasm. But I loved it. I thought it was a wonderful book. It's dark, it's psychological, it's full of ideas. It's got that kind of coming of age thing, the sort of, being a student, so relationships with teachers and with fellow students, and your first sort of, sexual experience, all those things. I think one of the reasons why I really, really liked it is because it's the kind of fantasy that's like set in a world that is kind of like the real world, but with a twist, with an element of magic in that world. But the magic system was really solid. It made sense. It worked. I would warmly recommend it if you're at all interested in sort of fantasy and the dark end of fantasy. I guess I had real strong characters, and that's important to me in a book. Particularly if it's a sort of a genre book, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway. Around the same time, I read another book linked to Ukraine. 2022, I read quite a few books from either Ukrainian authors or about Ukraine. And this one was Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine. And it was a 4-star rather than a 5-star read. I mean, on the borders, I guess. But I mention it because, sometimes when something's in the news and it's you're trying to understand what's happening now, the thing that helps me most sometimes to understand, and I think it's particularly true in this case, is to get the long view, to understand the history. And so reading a book that was about the area that is now the country Ukraine, sort of over the last, 1,500 years or more, it's a long history, although with a lot about the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th and 20th centuries and 21st century into the 21st century. It's by Reid, and if you want to get your head around what's happening, it's a recommendation from me. In ideas of country and belonging and nationality, absolutely key to what's happening in Ukraine. My first book that I read in 2023 is a book that explores some of those things, but in Britain and bang up to date, Britain today. And it was a book of poetry and photography, written by two friends. The poet was Roger Robinson, and the photos were by Johny Pitts, who's also an author and a sort of journalist. And it's one of those books that's hard to explain, and I wish I had the copy. It's at Tilly's house in Leeds, so I can't show you. But there's the juxtaposition of the photos and the poems, and a journey that they make around the coast of Britain, exploring, I suppose, a different perspective on what it means to be black in Britain today. Really, a superb book. Roger Robinson is a very fine poet. I read his book, A Portable Paradise, a couple of years ago, and it was one of my sort of top poetry books of that year. And this was a wonderful way to start 2023 with a bang, a really good book of poetry. One of the things I quite like to do in January is catch up reading, things that I've been meaning to read for a while but have got squeezed out, perhaps because I'm taking part in events and readathons and months of this and months of that. And I did that this January, and one of those, well, a couple of those were 5-star reads for me. One of those was The Promise by Damon Galgut, which I've been meaning to read since it came out in 2021. He's a South African author. I read one of his books years ago, The Good Doctor, which was excellent. So when this one came out and I heard it was good, it was on my mind to read it, and then it won the Booker, and then perhaps more importantly, in 2021 and early 2022, I had a load of booktubers I respect saying it was a really good book, and it absolutely is. It does the things that literary fiction should do. It's got interesting perspectives, an interesting style. It's got ideas. It's got strong characters. There's plot, even though it's sort of linear, but in episodes. It's structured actually around, in effect, a series of deaths, although you don't initially realise that. And it's got some really searing things to say about sort of race relations and politics and the attitudes of the sort of white Afrikaner population in South Africa, and then the shape of South Africa today, since the end of apartheid. Yeah, if you haven't read it, do. It's worth going back to, even though it's from a couple of years ago. Another that I read that hadn't been on my TBR for quite so long, but was very high on it, was The Colony by Audrey Magee, and that sort of pushed itself to the top of the pile because I watched a load, or in January, early January, end of December, of people's best books of 2022, and The Colony kept them up again and again as one of people's, most loved books of the year. And when you have a book like that, it's always a bit of a risk, isn't it, that when you actually come to read it, it won't live up to those expectations because they've almost been raised too high. Another book I read around the same time was Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, and I had a brilliant experience of reading that with a group of other readers, a Voxer group organised by Kim of Middle of the Book March, and there's a book a month happening. It's a kind of like a book club, I suppose, and not too late to join that, but as I say, it was the January book, and it was a good book, but I'd heard so many people enthuse about it that I think it slightly took the shine off it for me. But The Colony, that absolutely did not happen. Audrey Magee is an Irish author. It's set in Ireland in 1979. If you know anything about kind of modern Irish history, you will know that was a period when the Northern Irish conflict, the Troubles, as we knew it as at the time, were at their peak. But this is in a different bit of Ireland, kind of a remote island, and these two visitors come to this island and sort of project onto it an artist and a linguist, one English, one French, and they're sort of, both of them in their different ways, are using the small group of people that live on this island to satisfy their own needs and purposes. So it's a book about language, and it's a book about colonialism, and it's also a book about violence, because the what's happening in the Troubles is interwoven into the book in a very clever way that starts out feeling as if it's quite separate, and then gradually the two things come closer and closer together. It's an absolutely brilliant book, I thought. And March, coming up soon, is the Irish Readathon. So if you're looking for, to read just one book for that, and you haven't yet read The Colony, please read it. Please do. Another of my 5-star reads of these 3 months is another Irish book that I would equally enthusiastically recommend, although it's very different. And if you've already read The Colony and you want another Irish book recommendation from Roz. This one, okay. It's called A Ghost in the Throat. It came out in, I think, 2020. It was a debut novel. Well, I say novel, but I'll come back to that, by the Irish poet Doireann Griofa. And it's a book that it operates, well, we're almost coming full circle back to Ernaux and Sebald, because this is a book that it operates in a strange territory that's somewhere between memoir and literary biography and poetry. It's very hard to define what this novel is, other than amazing. It's a novel for people. It's short and intense, and it's for those of you that don't mind a sort of unconventional structure and way of writing. There we go. That was my highlights of November, December and January. It's lovely to be back. It's great fun to be talking about books again. I will have more to come, no doubt. But for now, I'll sign off and see you soon, Booktube.